Okay, we are going live to YouTube, and I will just get this started up, and I'll catch it to mute it here. Yep, we're live. Welcome to all the people who are on YouTube, all of you throughout time and space who are watching this on YouTube. It's good to be with you. We are continuing on with our Bible study series, our midweek, our evenings of the week Bible study series. And we're on our third week. The first 2 weeks, we were gaining speed. We were getting off the ground. Today, we're finally going to get the plane in the air. We're finally going to actually dive into the Bible itself, what is in the Bible. We've talked about what it is, where it comes from, what's all in it as far as the number of books and that kind of thing. But today, we're finally going to talk about what is in it. So I'm excited to be doing that with you today. First of all, before we turn to our books, I have a video that I'd like to share with you regarding the first chapter. Like I said, we're just getting the plane in the air. And so the first thing that we're doing is talking about the first thing in the Bible, Genesis chapter 1. And I'm assuming that this is something we've dealt with on many different occasions, many times before. If you went through Sunday school like I did, this was oftentimes the first unit of the year. We talked about the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. And that's absolutely wonderful. It's absolutely a great thing to do. But there's so much going on in this chapter that I have learned recently from my time doing Bible studies like these, showing videos like these, stuff that I am just becoming aware of myself. And I would like to share that with you. So this is the group that I've used on as often as I can, the Bible Project people from Seattle, Washington. So without further ado, here is their video on Genesis chapter 1. And I'm going to test it out to make sure it's playing correctly, but I think, well, actually I'd need to double check something here real quick before we get to that. And no, I had not done that, so I'm glad I double checked. Okay, here we go. And it's not playing.
And we're going to look closely at the first page of the book of Genesis.
Yep, I just need to do some settings here. That's what I want, yes. Okay, let me try this again. I thought I heard it playing. There it is.
In the beginning, God created the skies and the land.
Now, your Bible translation might say in heaven.
So let's start from the beginning.
The first book in the Bible is called Genesis.
And we're going to look closely at the first page of the book of Genesis. It's a carefully crafted narrative about God creating and ordering the whole cosmos.
Okay, let's check it out. Now, the opening line in the whole Bible is, in the beginning, God created the skies and the land.
Now, your Bible translation might say the heavens and the earth. In biblical Hebrew, the word for heaven refers simply to the sky above, and the word for earth does not mean globe, but rather the land.
The ground below us.
Right. This line is summarizing what's going to happen in the following narrative, which starts in the next line.
And it reads, now the land was wild and waste.
This phrase rhymes in Hebrew. The land was tohu vavohu, which means unordered and uninhabited. This is the ancient way of talking about the pre-creation state, what we might call nothingness. For the biblical authors, non-existence means having no purpose and no order. And the next line uses another image to say the same thing.
And darkness was on the face of the deep abyss.
It's another common way the ancients describe the non-reality that preceded creation. Now, here's where things start to get interesting, because in the midst of those dark waters, God is present.
And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
The Hebrew word for God's Spirit is ruach, which can refer to wind or breath or God's invisible presence.
So you can't see it, but God is present in the darkness, ready to bring order so that life can flourish.
Yes, and this ordering happens in a series of 6 days.
Each day begins with the phrase, and God said, and then ends with the phrase, and there was evening and morning.
Yeah, every day addresses those problems introduced in verse 2, that there's no order and no inhabitants. So on days 1 through 3, God splits apart that unordered darkness into 3 ordered realms. Then, on days 4 through 6, God fills the uninhabited wasteland with creatures.
Interesting. Let's see how that works.
Okay, so the first realm of order begins with light on day 1.
Ah, yes. Let there be light.
This is God's own glorious light that fills and contains the darkness as he separates day from night. God's establishing the order of time.
Okay, and then on day 2, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. What's the vault?
In the ancient culture of the biblical authors, the sky was perceived as a solid dome that holds back waters. God's depicted here as splitting the chaos waters in half, above and below, which creates the realms of the sky and the seas.
And then on day 3, let the waters under the sky be gathered into one place and let dry ground appear.
God is establishing the realm of the land, and it emerges out of chaotic waters. And then there's a bonus creative act on day 3. God invites plants and fruit trees with seed to emerge out of the land.
Okay, so we got the realms of time, the realm of the sky and seas, and the land. And they all have order, right?
Now, it's time to go back and fill these realms of days 1 through 3 with inhabitants. And this is what happens on days 4 through 6.
So on day 4, let there be lights in the vaults of the sky.
God installs these lights, the sun, moon, and stars, as signs and symbols that reflect God's own light. He gives them his own royal power to separate day and night.
Then on day 5, let the waters swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the land.
Yeah, these are the creatures that live in the waters below, and those that fly near the waters above.
Then finally on day 6, let the land produce living creatures.
They emerge up out of the ground to live on the land. And then, matching that bonus act of creation on day 3, God makes a special land creature, human, or in Hebrew, Adam. Then, God provides all of those plants from day 3 as abundant food.
Now over and over, God says what he created was good. But then after making humans, God says that it is very good.
Yes, humanity is the climax of days 1 through 6, and their importance is explained in the first poem in the Bible.
So God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them.
So humans come up from the ground like the other land creatures, but they're also more. They're God's image, which means that together, men and women embody and represent the Creator within his creation.
God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, ruling over the creatures."
This is the purpose of being God's image, to oversee creation as God's partners and representatives in the world.
Very cool.
Now, after the 6 days, we get a concluding line that links back to the key words of the opening line.
And so we're completed the skies and the land and all their inhabitants.
Except there's one more day. It stands outside the pattern of days 1 through 6. It's the big climax.
And God completed on the 7th day the work which he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all the work which he had done. And God blessed the 7th day and set it apart as holy.
So God rests on the 7th day. This is a standard biblical image where God, after ordering the cosmos, comes to rest and dwell in his sacred space. It's like the whole world is a holy temple where God lives with his people.
Now that phrase, there was evening and morning, it doesn't appear on day 7.
That's right. The 7th day has no end. That's because Genesis 1 is describing God's ideal vision for the whole cosmos.
A place where God lives
1 has woven the number 7 into every part of the story. There are 7 days of creation, 7 announcements that creation is good. There are 7 Hebrew words in the opening verse, and then 2 times 7 Hebrew words in verse 2. And then the statement about the 7th day has 3 lines of 7 words.
Wow. So the first page of the Bible is doing way more than just telling us how the world was made.
Right. Genesis 1 has been designed to show us that God's purpose is to share creation with his images, so they can rest and rule it with him forever. And that purpose is what the rest of the biblical drama is all about.
Okay. So that's kind of our primer for today, if you will. It's a 7-minute video that, again, it's just loaded. It doesn't give you a chance to take a breath. There's so much stuff in there. But is there anything that jumped out at you that you have questions about or would like to bring out for the group before we continue on for today? The biggest thing is just to kind of lift up the overall flow and structure of Genesis chapter 1. It is a different literary style than anything that comes after it. It's kind of a mixture, if you will, of narrative and poetry. And there's reasons for that. There are uses for that. But there's definitely a purpose behind the writing of Genesis chapter 1.
What you said was true. That's the first thing in Sunday school.
Right? Yep.
Like with little preschoolers, you start there.
Yep.
And pretty much the same person wrote the first 5 books of the Bible.
Traditionally, the first 5 books of the Bible are attributed to Moses. But you can, I mean, if you're starting to pull this apart on a scholarly level, you can really quickly tell, this whole thing is kind of a patchwork quilt, if you will, pulling from this source and kind of stitching it together, pulling from this source and stitching it together. Oral traditions here, the stories that the people of God carried with them for so long until it gets to us today. And I was going to, I'll jump ahead for a second. I wanted to imagine with you, because like I said, we've done this before. We've covered this chapter before, the creation account before. But what might be new is remembering that we're not the first people to cover this chapter. This chapter has been covered for a long, long time. And so I wanted to invite your imagination to go back to when it started, when this account, when this story was first being told to God's people. And it did not look like this. The whole New Testament had not been written yet. Much of the rest of the Chronicles of the Kings and the history of Israel, it wasn't there yet. And that's where I would like to take us when we get to a certain point in here and ask the question, okay, what was this story doing for those people back when it was originally first written? Does that kind of make sense? And we'll get there. That's kind of where we're going. So I'm going to close this one. Hello. And I will bring this one up and bring it back over to us over here. And push play. Grab this one and drag it out of our way. And maximize this. Okay. Now we're ready to go. And finally, for For Zoom, I will be sharing this one. And I wish this toolbar would get out of our way, but I'm not quite sure how to do that right now. But anyway, if you would like to follow along in your book, turn now to pages 42 and 43. And we start with this picture. You should recognize this picture. We have our planet Earth. We're talking about creation. We're talking about the large-scale creation, first of all. And we've got some interesting quotes here regarding this planet that we call our home. Statements by 2 U.S. astronauts help us see our home from a different perspective from outer space. James Irwin, who walked the moon during the 1971 Apollo 15 mission, wrote this: "The Earth reminded us of a Christmas tree ornament hanging in the blackness of space. As we got farther and farther away, it diminished in size, and finally it shrank to the size of a marble, the most beautiful marble you can imagine. That beautiful, warm, living object looked so fragile, so delicate, that if you touched it with a finger, it would crumble and fall apart. Seeing this has to change a person, has to make a person appreciate the creation of God and the love of God." And certainly, if you are fortunate enough to have this tradition that you've grown up in with your faith, and you see this perspective, it takes on a whole new meaning. The other one from John Glenn is very similar, but I'd like to move forward. On the next page, we have the creation on a smaller level, but certainly inside of each of us is a whole universe in and of itself. And we have here more interesting facts, fun facts. There's a whole page full of them. I won't read all of them, but there's some really interesting ones. Like number 1, if we could join end to end all the veins, arteries, and capillaries found in the average human body, they would reach from 2.5 to 4 times around the equator, or 60,000 to 100,000 miles. So the mileage that a blood cell within the human body gets during its journey. And if you stretched all those end to end, you would wrap 2.5 to 4 times around the circumference of the Earth. I like number 3. The brain is made up of about 10 billion nerve cells or neurons, and each one has many connection points to the others. Professor Pyotr Ankohin, a disciple of Pavlov in the field of psychology, estimated the number of connections and pathways that could be made by a normal human brain was the number 1, followed by 6.25 million miles of zeros. And even with all those connections in my mind, I can't quite comprehend that number. If one could unravel all the tiny fibers that make up the average human brain, they would stretch approximately to the moon and back. And your brain, maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't, is the largest consumer of carbohydrates in your body. With all the different connections and the electrical activity going on up in there, the different connections that are being made. That's why after I get done writing my sermon, I'm hungry. I need some chocolate or something. And there's more about the heart, the eye, the ear. But going down to the bottom, in Psalm chapter 139, 13 and 14, we read the psalmist who writes, "It was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That's the main concept that we wanted to put on the table as we begin with the creation story. God is the one who made the heavens, the earth, and each of us. And now I'll just give you a quick heads up, because this curriculum series, these books, there is definitely an agenda. There's definitely a bias that will show forth, that will reveal itself. It's not one that I disagree with. It's a wonderful agenda to have. But there are times when it can be kind of smacking you in the face, and this is one of those. That agenda is that since God is the one who created the heavens and the earth and me and all of humanity, it belongs to God. If we just throw this to the bottom of the screen, there's a little gift tag, if you will, that is attached to the planet Earth. And for those who were not here the first 2 weeks, this interesting symbol right here, this circle, black circle with the 4 arrows coming out in every direction, that's what this curriculum does to represent God. God has no beginning, no end, and so that's where the circle is useful. And these arrows coming out in every direction indicate that God's love goes out from God to all of us. God's activities go out from God to all of us. It is a direct contrast to the symbol for sin, which is a arrow going around in a circle, always coming back to itself. Sin is being curved inwards, and that is the opposite of God's activities, which are always focused on us, on others in God's creation. But does this make sense? This concept, this message that is being made by this Bible study series? That we humans own nothing in the end because we didn't make it. God has gifted it to us to manage, to care for, to rule over, to subdue, and to cause to grow, definitely. But in the end, it all belongs to God. I'll stop and take a breath myself at any questions so far or comments. Planet Earth and all of creation belongs to God, as does our own bodies. And so the message on the bottom one is to develop, care for, and use responsibly. We are called to manage ourselves in ways that are healthy, in ways that reflect well upon God, so that we can be useful for work in God's kingdom. All right, next page. After this page, we will jump into some of the details in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, actually. But before we do that, here is a representation of what God's original plan was. This is the ideal, as it is represented for us up on the wall, up on your pages. This is what God had in mind originally for his creation. So, just taking it a piece at a time, kind of breaking it down. If you want to follow along in your books or up on the wall, we'll take it a piece at a time. God's plan was that all people would live together under God as the king. Here's that symbol, the crown on top of God. So God is the king of all creation. God is ultimately the authority, the ruler, the one who decides what is good, what is not good, the one who pronounces judgments, the one who pronounces edicts. And we are called to rule together with him, but God is the king. As we add in together, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. God intended all of us to be one united family together on this planet, on God's good creation. And here's the first time we see this representation. We have a group of people holding hands together in a circle with something in the middle of them. This is a symbol for community. And sometimes it will be even more simplified to just have the heads of everybody shown. So a ring of circles around something in the middle. And this something in the middle is what brings the people together as a community. And so in this case, it's a very simple concept. Simply because we share this creation, we share this planet Earth. That's what makes us a community. That's what we hold in common, what we hold together. It's an easy concept. All people, no matter old or young, male or female, Jew or Gentile, slave or free, everyone united together in this purpose. And getting back to these people up at the top, this is a nod back to last week. These arrows, again, there are 4 arrows coming out from God up here to indicate that God's interest, God's actions, God's love goes out from God in every direction to the rest of creation and certainly to us as well. So now we see arrows coming out from the male and female character here, from you and I. There's an arrow going up to God, and it seems like the same arrow is actually going across to our neighbor. This is representing we love God by loving our neighbor. We love our neighbor by loving God. They are one and the same action, arrow. In fact, Jesus was the first rabbi who took these 2 commandments and made them into one. The Jewish community recognizes Jesus as the first one to do that. When he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He lists 2 of them. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. They asked him, what was the greatest? And Jesus gave them 2, as if to say they are one and the same. Together, they make the greatest commandment. One final detail here. We have 2 individuals in a kneeling position. The answer to my question, what do you think this is? What do you think this means? The first answer that everyone always gives is they're praying. And that's close, but it's not what this symbol is representing. The symbol ties in closely with this concept that we love God by loving others. The word for love is the word agape in the original Greek language, which is actually to put one another first, to serve one another. And so, if you're continuing along in this curriculum for any length of time, this is also a good symbol to log away in your mind, because we'll see this one again. Jesus is always shown in this kind of a pose, putting others first, serving others with everything that he has. So again, this is the original plan, the ideal that God had in mind for all of creation, as if to say this is what the 7th day rest would have looked like. Once everything was done, once everything was ordered, plugged in, push play on the creation, this is the kind of world that God had in mind. Thoughts on that? Questions?
What happened?
That's next week. That is next week. We will talk about what happened. But for now,
There's nothing in there about accumulating individual wealth if we're serving one another.
yeah, that's kind of the opposite of serving one another. It's putting ourselves first at the expense of others. That symbol is on page 30, if you wanted to take a quick look back. It's on several others, but I found it on page 30. We are introduced to the symbol for God on square number 2. And then on square number 4, we see that symbol for sin on top of the male and female figures down at the bottom. That everything they're interested in, concerned about, is themselves at the expense of others. All right, so if there's no other questions about this, then I invite you to turn the page to get into some more of these unspoken aspects of Genesis chapter 1. I'll leave that image up there on the screen, but there's no more illustrations for us for today. Just a lot of these interesting details. And again, I want to invite you to think through what was the world like when this was first written. Who was around? What other kingdoms were going on? And yeah, does anybody have any ideas? What time was this? As best as we can guess, is about 3000 BC, give or take. And the reason, one of the pieces of evidence to support that is how so many of these details are in direct conversation with the world at that time, in direct conversation with some of the other competing stories of the time. This story didn't come to be in a vacuum all its own. It was written in conversation with the other kingdoms of the world, with the Babylonians, with the Egyptians, with the Hittites. There's all kinds of those jabs at them. Is any of this, is this all new? Or is any of this familiar so far? This is going to be a lot to swallow if it's all new. So I just wanted to take it as a piece at a time. I'll cut it into as small bite-sized pieces as I have to.
You know, with so much going on now, I kind of forgot this that I learned years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
Because it's so different.
I think it's been 4 years.
Well, that seems.
Yeah, that's a while ago. Yeah, you were in the second tour through this one that I did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then the third tour, yeah. So it's been a little while.
Yeah.
I always have some refreshers that I do when I get to this point. But just, how is this so far? And I ask because when it comes to the creation account, if we can get over this hurdle together, we'll be home free. There's nothing else really that we'll be dealing with that has the attention of popular and religious culture today. It's like this is the battleground. We have to have this mean a certain thing, or else all is lost. And I don't quite share that approach. I wish we could call a ceasefire. Because if you know what I'm talking about, it seems like if you believe this way, you're in one camp. If you believe another way, you're in this camp. And then people are just logging grenades back and forth, or missiles back and forth, to try and win this battle. And I don't think that battle is helpful at all when it comes to what the message of the Bible is all about. So like I said, I wish we could call it a ceasefire. But if you're with me so far, just take a look on page 50 with me now. The last sentence before we get to the numbered items. The passage makes the following points, either explicitly or implicitly, either out loud or subtly underneath. And we'll go through several of these. We won't go through all of them, but number one, we believe there's only one God. And in fact, for the people of God, for the Hebrew people who were seeing this for the first time, hang on a second, there's more. Okay, that's for later. That's for later on. For the Hebrew people of this time, they actually would have allowed for other gods in the world. The word God is actually a category, and the Bible talks about other Elohim, other deities. And Moses talks about the different gods of the other kingdoms of the world. The Psalms talks about how you've made humans a little lower than the gods. And so this is not entirely accurate if you go to what the Bible is saying. If we bring it forward to today, this is what we subscribe to. This is what we confess, what we believe. There's only one God. But what about this God? That's what this chapter in Genesis is talking about. Number 2, God is asexual. Although the Bible does speak of God as He, it does not ascribe maleness or femaleness to God. That's in direct comparison to all the other deities of the other cultures of that time, which would accentuate the maleness or femaleness of the idol statues that they used to represent them. Interesting, the Hebrew language does not have a word for goddess. Number 3, we believe that God created everything through His all-powerful word, that God just spoke, and it was so. Now, this is in comparison to, for example, the Babylonian creation myth, where the chief god slew the dragon and used the dragon's body, broke it apart, and from that came the materials for creation. None of that going on here. The Epic of Gilgamesh, I think is the name of that one. And it's a thrilling tale of heroics, of struggle, and there was a cost to be paid. Compare that to what Genesis is saying with, it was easy. God just spoke, and poof, it happened. Wow, that God must be powerful. That God must be the stuff. Number 4, we believe the sun, moon, and stars are not deities. They are lights. They are lamps, and they're used to mark the times and the seasons, in direct comparison to what the other cultures were thinking in that day. Number 5 talks about reincarnation. That's not what we subscribe to. Number 6, the creation of humanity was the grand finale of the creative process, the crowning achievement of the creative process. In comparison to other thoughts at the time where humans were created to be the slaves of the gods, to serve the gods because they got tired of waiting on each other. And we could go on, but we don't necessarily need to. There's all kinds of ways that Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 2, verse 4a is saying, here's what we believe, and we reject the other things. All those other nations of the world, that's not the way it was. And it says something about the God that they followed. And I'll stop there for a second. What thoughts or questions do you have? Is this new?
I have, obviously evolution is taught in the schools and the process, and when you came back to God used His word, because where do you get the materials from? You always go back. Where did they get that from? How could that start? And the Big Bang Theory, well, what was before that? And it always goes back to the Word of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Other thoughts or questions?
Oh, I think number 2 is interesting. Is this an argument that a person can use who is lesbian or
Transgender.
gay or transgender or
I think certainly if someone is trying to make an argument against the very newly developing thoughts and feelings about binary gender, non-binary gender, and all the new ones that are kind of popping up. For us today, I think that one would definitely be a question. As far as what it was for them in that day and age, that much I don't know. I don't know what it would have been for them in their contemporary setting. And that's what I'm trying to put my finger on. So often when we reach in to the Bible and pull it out and put it on our tables today, that's where we have some juggling to do to make it fit with how our minds work. In the age of science, which says you can prove something and know how something works and why something does this, what the cause and effect is, all of that would have been foreign to the biblical world. It was just a different set of questions that the biblical world was concerned with. They wouldn't necessarily have been interested in the gay or lesbian or GLBTQ plus, any of that. That's not on their radar. And so that's a new question. One that I wonder if it's fair or even appropriate to try and reach into the Bible and pull something out to use for our conversations in the year 2021. How's that just as a statement that I just made? This is tumultuous territory that I'm trying to be bold and tread through, trying to lay down what I'm seeing here, why I'm seeing it. But I don't want to destroy anything either, if that makes sense. Like I said, if we can get through today, we'll be home free. Do you know what I mean, though, when I say that this issue has kind of been the ground zero for a lot of the struggles in the religious world for about the past 50 years or so? Creation and the rise of evolution with a new player on the scene. When was the theory of evolution even born? Sometime in the 1800s, I think.
1860s.
Right. And so, much like, and here's a new thought that I've had recently, much like the other stories in the Bible's world, the Bible was in conversation with them as competing stories for where the world comes from and how the world came to be and what that means for us and our place in it. Evolution was a new story, a competing story as far as the church was concerned. And so, as you look back at the history of the church's engagement with this new challenger, it's been shields up, if that makes sense. And that's just what I'm seeing as I'm taking a look back at what's been going on. Whether that needed to happen is a whole other conversation. Other questions?
What about the group that are like Jews for Jesus?
As far as this subject goes, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah.
I know a person that is active in that group,
Okay.
and she has to do a lot of explaining, you know, and yet, and then I also know there's when we were in Des Moines, pastor, well, no, it's not a pastor, but he was with the Jewish community, and he worked at Lutheran Hospital as a chaplain.
Okay.
And so he spoke a lot on that, you know, the problems that some of the Jewish people were having.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as the creation accounts, I'm not sure what their approach would be.
Yeah, I always wondered, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the ones that
Yeah.
have suffered so much.
So, all of these on page 50 are about Genesis chapter 1 and the first 4 verses of chapter 2. If you look at page 51, a lot of that was shown during the video. You can see the literary patterns. There are numerous literary patterns that can be detected, and there's a parallel. There's a link between days 1 and 4, days 2 and 5, days 3 and 6, and the video tried to show that. The patterns that are there 7 times, this sequence of phrasings shows up. 10 times, actually, it says that, and God said. There's a comparison that can be made to that and the 10 Commandments that come in Exodus. Seems like God likes to speak in groups of 10. Or maybe this was the foundation of the world that God was speaking into existence. And that the foundation for God's relationship with his people is based on that 10 Commandment structure again. Just some interesting stuff. Number 4 at the bottom of page 51 is kind of where, all this is heading. And I fully understand, and forgive me, but I'm picking up in this group that there's, some new messages being shown here that might be in direct conflict with the ones that we've been taught before. So number 4 says, although Genesis 1 contains magnificent truths about creation's origin and order, it is not an eyewitness report of days 1 through 7 of human history. The passage is strongly liturgical in tone and very likely was used in worship rituals. To read Genesis 1 without feeling moved to praise God is to miss the point of the chapter. I grew up in a tradition that taught me that God had a stenographer that would listen as God said how it was, and that's how the Bible came to be. Do you know what I'm talking about? That kind of an idea, that this is God's word, and in order for it to be God's word, God had to have said it. And it's like God's finger, touched the forehead of the writers and imbued the writer with everything that was needed, and when they woke up, there was the book of Genesis. That's kind of what I was taught. Elaine, I am very curious. Would you mind? I want to know.
I see it that way.
Okay, well,
I mean,
please let me know.
Okay, I feel that the Jewish people had to be taught, and this was all word of mouth, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
and word of mouth from ancestors way back,
Yeah.
and all the way along to try and keep the Jewish faith pure and to be taught about one God,
Mm-hmm.
not various gods,
Right.
So I see it as many writers, and you say, you know, you think Moses composed or was responsible for the first chapters, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
okay, because he was the leader. But that had to be, in my opinion, a lot of word of mouth, and then somebody finally started writing it down. Somebody started writing it down.
Yeah, right.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
not Moses himself, and yes, you know, he made it happen. Because honestly, I have a hard time comprehending people of that day, one, having something to write it on, two, having something to write it with, you know?
Yes.
Yeah, because when
And
was
it's pretty
paper-
much like the history of any one of our families. It really isn't written down unless you are really into genealogy. It
Mhm.
is word of mouth of what your dad used to do and what I used to do and what my school was like and like what your school was like. And, you know,
Until at some point.
until somebody
starts
decides
to write it.
genealogy, I'm gonna write this down about mom and dad so that we can remember exactly and tell their
Right.
great-greats what really happened, you know?
Right.
So, yeah. When you're talking
And
about your stenographer thing, I'm thinking,
You're
No.
mentioning also,
Okay.
when was paper invented, when did they start having
right.
actual, formal instruction?
yeah, you
I
know,
don't know.
I just,
And to be
Yeah.
absolutely fair, you know, maybe that image is something I came up with. Maybe
but
it's
still.
not something we necessarily know how to talk about. If this is the Word of God, when you start, you know, we consider this to be a divine book, right? But it's also a human book.
yeah,
It's both of those. And we should have no problem with something like that because that's Jesus. Jesus was divine and human together, both at the same time. We have a book that God speaks to us through, but there are so many fingerprints in the Bible that have human fingerprints on them. It's not trying to hide them. It's right there for anyone to see. So it's both at the same time.
I think that's where our faith has, the word faith, not the religion that you're in, has to come
Mhm.
from. You have to have faith that this is, you know, what was passed on and on and on and on and on, you know.
The mere reality that it survives to this day is kind of a miracle in and of itself.
We also gotta remember, God is all powerful, so if he wanted somebody to be able to actually write this down, he could. I mean, because look at the Ten Commandments,
Right,
Yeah, they were written on stone.
emblazed in stone.
right. And at that point, God's the only one that could really do
Yeah.
that.
And so, you know,
Mhm.
we can't just completely discount that Moses didn't actually write this down because God could have enabled him to. He enabled him
Right.
to build an ark. What did, you know, we say, well, okay, where did all these
Mhm.
materials come from? We didn't have paper, we didn't have, well, they didn't have nails, and they created
Right.
something in order to do it.
But what I'm picking up on what you're saying is a very common rebuttal that happens, that it's either all true or none of it's true. And, you know, that's a very common attempt to undermine what's going on in there. There are points in the Bible where it is not accurate as far as just the historical details. There are points where it disagrees with itself, where it contradicts itself. The Gospels are an example of that. We have 4 different stories, and there are details in there that are in direct contradiction with each other. But so what? The authority of it is not authoritative to me because it's a scientific resource. That is not what the Bible's trying to be. There was no science around when it was written. The Bible is a persuasive document. To me, that's what it is. So forgive me for stopping, but I wanted to make sure, because this issue, creation, can cause people to go to war. And I don't want anybody to go to war. Let's wrap things up. We did page 51, more or less. Pages 52 and 53 put the reality on the table that there's actually two creation accounts in the first couple chapters of Genesis. Some refer to Genesis chapters 1, verse 1 through 2, verse 4a as creation account 1, and then Genesis 2, verses 4b to 25 as creation account 2. The following gives some discussion about how they are similar and how they differ. And I'll try quickly to lift some of those things out. We did Genesis 1, verse 1 through 2, verse 4a. It's a very structured explanation. It's a very poetic presentation. Genesis 2, verse 4b through 25, at the bottom of page 52, is different. It has a much less theological tone to it. And in fact, the word for God is different from chapter 1 to chapter 2. If you have a Bible in front of you, I would encourage you to take a look, because I think that is lifted out. The way the translators handle that in chapter 1, it's God, and God said, and God said, and God said, each and every time. And then all of a sudden, in 2 verse 4b, what is it? Read chapter 2, verse 4b.
This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. That's
Keep going. What's the next one?
when the Lord God
And stop right there.
When the
Lord God. That is a different word in the Hebrew, a different name for God. And the translators that translated into English achieved that by saying, now, the Lord God. But that's new. In chapter 1, it was God said, God said, God said. The word in chapter 1 is Elohim. I don't remember what the word is in chapter 2. But that right there is a huge clue that this is a different source, a different story that is now being included here. And this story is when God formed the man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and that was the first thing. It was in a desert. There was nothing growing yet. No life was possible yet. But then God caused the garden to grow, and all the animals, God formed them. So many times, I don't know about you, but I would always just gloss over that. Or this is kind of a recap. We're going back and we're covering the same story a second way, but this is a different account. And this one continues on through chapter 11. This style, this story, beginning here, the story goes all the way through chapter 11 before it finally switches over to a different style yet again. All right.
So, question here.
Yes.
Do you feel that when it says evening and morning came and it was the first day and then yada yada and it was the second day?
Yeah.
Do you feel that was a 24-hour day?
No.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Arlen. It's like, okay. I used to. Boy, I used to. I used to fight. I used to be a big defender of that because that's how I was brought up. And I went to college ready to fight. I had my artillery, my weapons. And I got to college and I figured out there's no one that's coming after me. No one's coming for me. I was throwing punches, but but no one was fighting it. And that was kind of, I lost my balance for a while. And then I went to seminary, and that was a big process too. Good question. Thank you. Any other questions?
I just feel like, when you're talking about then the verses, the story kind of, because I always feel like it's filling in what happened in the creation,
Mm-hmm.
Like that didn't make any sense, but it's filling it in what happened throughout the time God is creating all this, not just a 24-hour period of 7 days.
And that's perfectly fine.
So that's not-
Yeah,
so
to
that's
have
not
that, to subscribe to
actually-
that approach.
It's not, so you view it as actually not a second account of creation, as a
Filler. Yeah,
more detailed
Mhm.
explanation.
that's the way I kind of feel.
Yep.
Yeah, a more detailed explanation of how he created, not necessarily a 24-hour period
Mm-hmm.
day.
And, creating Adam out of the dust, the clay,
Mm-hmm.
if you had to go to science and see what the human body is made of, and they have all the trace elements, and they're pretty much
Mm-hmm.
what's in salt water, what's in the ocean,
Yeah.
and what is it, you are what you eat, but the plants got the nutrients out of the soil, so
Mhm.
it's always going back.
Yeah.
But we are created by God in a fantastic way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I fully agree. That's a good place to end, unless there's any other questions. Like I said, turn the pages, there's even more interesting stuff, but I'll leave that to all of you for your enjoyment. All right, let me go ahead and bring our live stream to a close. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Thank you for being a part of this. Hope you've enjoyed it.